spotlight my video. So hello and welcome to what for me is a very rainy, ultra typical November day. Look out of the windows and it truly is November. So I'm quite pleased to be indoors with you for the next hour or so, and we can get creating and making. So in front of me, I've got last week's finished piece. So this is what I finished in our make and create session. And I have actually I've hung it up. I have decluttered my peg rail in the kitchen and then hung that in place. And I'm rather pleased with it. And also, actually, I've got it on next week's project. It does look quite nice, elevated on a little stand. And also, of course, you could use it as a very decorative flower frog and arrange fresh flowers through that. So I hope you've enjoyed, or if not making this project, thinking about what you might want to do for this project. I am certainly going to keep that up for a few more weeks. It's definitely got that sort of autumn vibes going before we move into Christmas time. And then for next week, it's I wish I'd looked up the spelling of this now so I could pronounce it properly. Himily, a himily wreath. So this is the wreath that we're making next week out of paper straws. This may take some time to do next week. So I will be prepping something, and probably, as I do with more complex pieces, I'll have 1/3 done and then show you how to fix together. So this, if I'm honest, is a little bit softer or not as firm as I would like it to be. So when I am making my next demonstration piece for you, I'm going to take special care to make sure my fixings are really tight in order that the wreath is more robust. If I'm totally honest, when I hang it up, it droops slightly. So the options are, don't hang it up. You could lie it flat on your table and use it as a table centerpiece, perhaps with a candle. And if you did specifically want to use it that way up, it's going to be a matter of firm fixings or using a wreath frame on the back and just very neatly strapping it to one of the metal wreath frames and hope that fades off into the distance. So what you will need for class next week are some drinking straws. So I have got some straws here. I've got black ones, which are the cocktail straws. And I've also got white ones, which are the conventional length straws. So it's entirely up to you what kind of straws you use. But I would say you do need to use straws. So I've got long ones and I've got short ones, but actually I'm going to have to trim all my straws to length. So do not trim them ahead of time because you might end up with something too small. But what we're going to be making is lots of these little pieces like this, these little units that look like pentagons. So you can see that, perhaps I might get away with cutting that straw just in half. Or this one, cutting it into thirds. So I will do some chopping later. And as I hold it up, you can then see that I need, I've got my hand there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of these little placements to go all the way around to complete a circle. If you discover next week that it's all a bit too fiddly for you, what you could do is make these individual little placements and just have it as an objet on your side, or perhaps string it with a bit of cotton and you could hang that up as a Christmas decoration. So it's going to be a little bit fiddly next week, and you're going to have a clear head to work with, but we'll get there. We will get there in the end, so do not worry. So as well as the straws, I'm going to be using paper covered wire. Mine's red, only because I'm running really short on my my tan and my green colour, and I wanted to use some wire that was not the real, wasn't falling apart. And I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do my black straws or my white straws. So you will find it much easier to work with a paper covered wire. Asking whether you know the size in advance. I'm not going to suggest a size. I will in the class next week, but it's not going to take you long to trim to size. But I will bring a ruler next week to tell you my size. But I would say it's going to be about ease of cutting, really. So you could measure the first one and then chop them down, and it won't take long. Honestly, it won't take long to cut. And the reason why I'm suggesting you don't do that ahead of time is because by varying the length of the straws, you can make a slightly different shape. So I think you're going to need to decide next week whether you're going to complete the total round or whether you want to make the individual hanging decorations. And actually, I think these hang better if they're a marginally different shape and you need slightly longer ones for top. So as an estimate, they're as long as my little finger, which is going to be 6 centimetres. But don't cut too much. It's like when you're doing anything, if you cut it all to length and then change your mind, when those straws are useless to you. So I would keep them as long as possible, in order that you've got, you're not wasting your materials. So on to this week's project. It's all about Scots pine. So perhaps you might want to let me know in the comments whether you're making and creating with me today, or have you managed to collect your Scots pine needles? And if you haven't, have you substituted something else in? Are you using silver birch twigs or something like that? So I was fortunate enough to find myself some fresh Scots pine. Do you remember when I showed you last week, I had my dried pine needles here, and for some reason they've dried and they're really sharp. You realize where they're called needles. So I'm not going to use the ones that have dried out. I'm going to use my fresh pine, and literally I have got a handful. I haven't got bunches and bunches and bunches. I think this is going to be sufficient for your project. And I know it's always really hard when you start off doing a project, thinking, well, exactly how much do I need? Well, I don't quite know how much you need, because of course I don't know how big your bottle is going to be. So I'm using I think I said this was a 2-litre bottle. You'll notice I've cut the bottom off because I've already got a part completed project to show you, but you could make this in one of the smaller drinking bottles. Right, I can see there has been some pine needle collection going on. That's good. And again, it depends what size you want to do. Or it may be that you want to use something else that's circular, whether you've got a small yogurt pot, the inside of a roll of sellotape that you've used up your tape, something like that. But we're aiming for something that's going to be circular, and I've called it a cuff, as if you were going to wear it as a bracelet on your wrist. So the first thing we need to do, I am just going to cut my bottle to size when I'm facing you, and then pretty much everything else will be done over the top edge. So I'm going to take my floristry scissors, and I don't know whether your bottle's like this, but can you see with mine, it's got some shape to it, some grooves in it. That just makes it really easy for me to cut. If your bottle is just totally smooth, you may well want to measure out how wide your cuff is going to be in order that it's a consistent width all the way around. So again, looking at widths here, this is I'm probably going to cut 3 to 4 centimeters, something like that. And the problem with cutting is always getting started. So I'm going to pinch my bottle together and give it a snip. And then this is very noisy, my end, and then cut round, following those grooves in the bottle, so I can just eye up where I'm going because I'm following the little track line in the bottom. And then we can get rid of that, unless of course you want to make duplicate copies of your little cuff. But I am going to move that out of the way, and then I'm just, as you cut, sometimes you get little jaggedy lines. I'm going to cut those off. Now, the way we're going to add on our pine needles is I'm going to use double-sided tape. You could use glue. The reason why I haven't used glue, though, is because I have got my hot glue gun to the side. If you're using the hot glue gun, you just need to be sure that as you glue onto your plastic, it's not going to melt. But I'm particularly concerned about using my hot glue gun and then taking my pine needles. I'm just going to rip them off the stem. Pine needles in that sort of scissor shape. We're going to thread them through like that. And I'm just a bit concerned that by the time I've put my daub of hot glue on there and then squashed my pine needles together so it adheres, that I'm going to end up with burnt fingers and lots of knobbly glue, because I won't be able to glue put much glue on at once. You know, normally when you use hot glue, you might do like a centimetre strip and then you start working. I'm just concerned with the amount of time it's going to take me to pick up my pine needle to put it on, that my glue will have dried, or I would have burnt my fingers in trying to get it to stick in place. So I'm going to use double-sided sellotape. So what I would do, again for ease, I'm just going to put this on now, and then when we get close, I will show you what I'm going to do. Now, sadly, my double-sided sellotape is quite narrow. It's probably about a centimetre wide. You can get wider double-sided tape, and that would be much easier to put on because you probably just put one big strip around the front and there you go. So I'm having to do this in 2 goes. I'm going to cut myself a square edge there. So put the tape on, run it around the edge. As long as you don't overhang the edge, it's fine. You want to be, you know, roughly in a straight line, but it doesn't matter if you wibble and wobble a little bit. So you can see there that I need to put a second layer of tape on. What I'm going to do though, I added the tape in, I started here. I'm going to make sure, and again, I'll show you this up close when we come to my overhead camera. I'm going to start my tape in the same place, and I will explain why as we work through. So I've got a pair of tram lines going around my plastic bottle. And then because we're going to thread the pine needles through, and to try and get them to stick effectively, I need to do exactly the same thing on the inside edge of the plastic bottle as well. This bit is slightly trickier because you're working in the confines, but again, I'm finding out where my beginning was, and I'm putting my tape around the edge. So it's a tiny bit fiddly. Once you've peeled off the backing paper though, you'll end up with this clear tape on a clear bottle, and hopefully it's not going to be too obvious. And I'm cutting off. I was nearly going around twice then. And then exactly the same thing. So actually I've ended up with 4 pieces of tape here, 2 on the outside and 2 on the inside. But if you've got wider tape than me, you will just have 1 piece on the outside and 1 piece on the inside. So where is my beginning? I'm nearly back at the beginning. And I'm just, while I've got more elbow room, I'm just going to start off my peeling, because that can sometimes be the hardest bit, is peeling your tape back. So I'm just taking the opportunity of getting up close and personal with it to peel that back, just to start it off. I'm not going to peel it all the way, and I will talk you through that. So it's a piece of plastic with 2 lots of tape going around. So what I'll do now is I'll bring in the overhead camera, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do, and we'll take it from there. Okay, let's go then. So I've started off my tape, and I'm just going to peel back a little bit, probably a couple of centimetres. And the reason I'm doing that is because it's going to take you quite some time to put your pine all the way around, and you'll be ending up putting it down, putting it up, and you may walk away and finish it off another day. And I didn't want the tape to lose its tackiness. So you will find it beneficial just to work in small patches. And how long will it take to do? It will probably take you, I would think, at least 20 minutes of concerted effort to put your layer of pine needles all the way around. So it's like all these projects I show you, and I know I probably say it every single week, the skill isn't complex, it's time consuming. So what I'm going to do is to prepare my pine needle, I'm just ripping them off the main little branch, and as you look at them, they've all got this little brown knobbly bit, and then you have the 2 needles. If you're a bit rough with it, you might end up with individual pine needles. I would put those aside, because what we want is the joined pine needle. It's a bit like the lucky cherries. When you get your cherries in the summertime, you always want to make a pair of cherry earrings, and you quite simply slide it in. So I'm locking up as far as that'll go. I'm going to end up with a little, this wooden bit. sticking out at the edge. So that's the end, and then my actual bit of plastic is here. So it's overhanging, probably by about, you know, not quite a centimetre, and it'll give a little raised area. So you can see what I'm going to do. A bit like watching paint dry, and you will be pleased that I've done my blue Peter Mint. So what I'm trying to do here is to get really good solid coverage. But you'll notice that your pine needles, just bend that back, aren't straight. So as you work, the key thing to think about is I would concentrate on the base where that wooden bit is. And you're trying to lock the pieces of pine together, but you can see there are these little gaps. At the moment, don't worry about them. And you'll also find as well that as you go round, you start off, you can put them all sort of parallel, but you do get a bit of a bend round. So all the time just thinking, I'm trying to get those parallel, but I'm my main point of interest is to get a continuous ring of that little, the wooden bit at the end. And you can see here now why I didn't use my hot glue gun, because there's an awful lot of handling going on. Applying a bit of pressure to make sure that you are, it's getting nice and, you know, it's getting tacked down. And then, of course, I should have started here and worked downwards. As you filled up the space, you then just peel back and you reveal your next little bit of where you're going to start adding on the next lot of pine, like that. So you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to sit here for 20 minutes showing you how to do this, because you can well imagine exactly what I'm doing. So when you make this, you know, I would say get a film on, get your favorite radio program on. If you're into podcasts, that's the thing to do. So you can see exactly where I'm going with this. So by the magic of television, I will reach over and show you the finished one. And as I say, this took me about 20 minutes to complete. But you can see, although I have tried to get in, you know, to keep the coverage solid, actually you can see there, that's when I got tired at the end, it's a bit gappy. I did start off here where it's much more compact. And to get that extra coverage, you really do need to go round a second time. And this time you could put your double-sided tape around the edge. You could use perhaps your glue. I'm just a bit concerned that the plastic's a bit wobbly and I don't want to be knocking this too much by going with my double-sided tape again. That is an option. You could use your floral adhesive, and as you know, this takes a little while to dry. So for speed here, I am actually going to get my hot glue gun out and just bear with it. And it's rolling around a little bit. So I have got a can of tomatoes here that I'm going to wedge in just to hold everything a little bit steady. So here, because I want to keep my nice wooden edge, I'm not splitting my pine cones this time around. I'm going to lay them on the top. So trying to work with as minimal amount of glue as possible. It's a little bit of a squirt and it's lying down. I have got off to one side a kebab stick from last week, so I can push them into place in order that I don't hurt myself. But this is again a little bit painstaking, just a few dots at a time to go all the way around. So out of preference, I don't like using the hot glue because you do end up with that the milkiness behind. And it's those trails. And although, like I showed you last week, you can melt the trails off by using your hairdryer, you still get that sort of lump of glue at the bottom. So again, this is going to keep you quiet for a little while. Can you see? I don't know if that's picking it up on the camera there. My workmanship isn't quite as neat. So I would say what I would do is to get your cold glue, if you have it. I normally get my cold glue, put it on a saucer or a piece of paper, ooze it out like that, and then take my pine needle and sort of wipe it through, keeping it quite low. And this takes a little while to air dry, so it's not going to immediately dry in place. So I'm leaving it a chance. I'm not touching it. If you have a problem with it drying, you could use pegs to sort of clamp it in place as you go around. So it is a little bit fussy, an easy technique, but it is a little bit fussy getting, you know, first coverage round with your tape and then second coverage round. So this isn't something to be rushed. You just want to get a good coverage, and you may decide, actually, I quite like going around once. I'm not quite sure I got the time or inclination to go around twice. And you could leave it as just a single coverage and just don't tell anybody that you wanted it to be a little bit thicker. So it does look, you know, quite good, just a single coverage round. And what it gives me is this little sort of bushy crown thing. So you could, if you've ever made these before, when you've used perhaps a jam jar, for instance, and you've tied an elastic band around it and you've threaded your materials underneath the elastic band, you could tie off with your piece of string or your bind wire and hold it in place like that. But I thought, wouldn't it be nice that if we're trying to use a new technique, we're trying to keep, I don't know why I touched that, it's pulling off again. We're trying to, you know, just explore different ways of doing things. I thought I might create a tie to go around my little structure here using my Formium Tenax. Do you remember this from, was it way back in week 1? And I showed you the technique of how you can shred your Formium Tenax using your good old-fashioned pin holder. So when you do this, you will just need to be mindful of the fact that the pins, again, are sharp and quite heavy. I actually did this over my knee this morning, and I've left a dirty mark on my jeans. And I'm quite, actually, the easiest thing to do is to do it direct onto the table. But I didn't really want to be scratching my kitchen table. So you brush all the way down, and your Formium Tenax starts to separate out, she says. Separate. Yeah, I can feel it going now. So it does take 2 or 3 passes to separate out. And of course, depending on how long you want your strands to be, you'll end up with something a little bit like this. So imagine I'd done that the whole length of my Formium Tenax. I could then use that as a rope to tie around my finished container. So what I have actually done in terms of getting a rope, and again, I have done a little bit I've done earlier, is I have plaited a length of my Formium Tenax. Now, quite fortunately, this is getting lodged underneath my laptop, and you won't be able to tell that's been plaited, but you all know how to plait. You've got your 3 strands here, and I've come right down to the end of my 3 strands, and I've run out. I've got 1 good strand left, and I've got these 2 that are starting to look a little bit too fine. So what I will do is to pull off the sections I had created earlier by combing through, and I'm just going to lie them on top and continue the plaiting. So if you have ever plaited, it's the sort of technique you use when you do a French plait, and you're constantly gathering in. So I won't talk you through the plait because I'm sure you know how to do this. It is much easier to do though when you can weight your plait down, so you've got something a little bit taut to work against. So I'm going to go that way and that way. And then I've got a nice long strand there, nice long strand in the middle. This strand here is looking a bit thin to one side, so I'm just holding it up there. And then at the end, you can either cut out these little joining pieces or just leave them a little bit frizzy at the sides. So working my way down like that. So when I release this under the weight of my laptop, you will see that I've probably got a length of plaiting that is now about 40 centimetres long. And I thought that would be quite a nice way of just adding a decorative finish that was also going to be a tiny bit functional in terms of holding my pine needle cuff together. So what I'm going to do here at the end, I've decided that's long enough, I'm just going to knot it so it doesn't come apart. Cut off those loose bits there. Just going to lift my laptop up, and I've got a section of rope, of plaited rope, and you can see as I move it through, I've got little bits that, you know, a little bit hairy. I could keep those there, or I could just trim those out. But I wouldn't trim them out as you go along, because you don't want to weaken the rope until you've made it. Here I've got a bit that's quite thick, so I will take that out. Out of preference, I probably would have just left all the wispy bits, but I think it probably depends on what your natural style is in terms of, you know, finishing off your work. So I would take that like that. Again, I can wrap it round the edge, being ever so slightly gentle. I don't want to crush it. Have I done enough to go all the way around? I've done enough to go 2 loops. And again, tying it in a knot to finish off like that. And now that's tied, I'm going to get rid of the bits that I tied the knot in. So that was where I knotted to start. That was where I knotted to finish, and I can get rid of those because it will hold. So it's quite a nice decorative way of finishing off your little cuff. And then it's about what decorations do you want to add. So I have got my pyracantha berries from last week. I'm thinking I could glue some of these into the finish. And I'm just thinking now, I'm wondering whether with those sharp needles, I could pierce them onto my little ends here. So I could either glue them randomly around the edge, or I could add them to the top edge of my little cuff here. So they've got, as I said before, the pine needles, a nice sharp point, and you could do, you know, a little covering every now and again. You could just a little dusting, or you could do it quite heavily as well. You've also got the other option of threading your little berries onto wire, and again you could do the same thing, that you could do that as a circlet around the top edge, and that would make a really lovely cuff for a candle. And at this stage I will say, just make sure you watch your candle as it burns down. You can see here my candle is approximately the same height as my pine needles, which if I was to burn down just represents a fire risk. But the other thing I wanted to show you in terms of being, you know, perhaps you think, oh, I've done this kind of project before, you know, I want to do something a bit different. Well, I think the bit different here is to turn your arrangement round and sit it on the table like this. And I will hold this up to the camera when we finish. That if you imagine a little bit of a magical world inside this arrangement, you've done your double cuffing round of pine needles. So it's really, really good, robust coverage. But perhaps then, for instance, you've got the little bit of, it's almost like this sisal that's left over in the teeth of your pin holder. And I had another little bit as well, that's escaped me from earlier on. But it may be that you want to sort of dress up the inside of the cuff. So you've got this little sort of placement, bits and pieces. And again, I will hold that up to the camera afterwards. And your pine needle, your pyracantha berries, that you could have this little setup on the side. So perhaps, you know, with you know, a flat, rather than being a flower arrangement as such, it becomes almost like a cornucopia, a gathering of things. And you could have that on a little tray, and it's fairy garden, that would be perfect. And there's a word as well, which a diorama is the word I was thinking of. I've got a little scene inside a crystal, and it's got a miniature Christmas tree and a little deer in there. But yes, a little magical fairy kingdom. So use your cuff conventionally, like that. You could put it on a dish, and I have got a dish that I'll show you how you can do that. You could put a flower arrangement in it, having spilling it out. It might be the cuff that you then decide to add your topiary tree to, with your stem and your ball of moss at the top. So it's akin to a basket, or as you say, the beginnings of a diorama, or, you know, safe shelter for Christmas time, and you can create your own little magical world inside. So I'm going to bring the camera back to me so you can see that hopefully in more detail. And I will put some pictures in the, tack it on to the end of the video as well, so you can see more clearly what it is that I'm doing. Bring things a little bit closer for you. So what I did think as well, I've got this little compote bowl that you may well have seen, that's one of the things I brought back when I was on my trip to Belgium. And I thought, again, you could raise it on there. And this bowl's a tiny bit too small. But if that sat down a little bit lower, and it's about being creative, and showcasing your skills. So here we are in the midst of a cost of living crisis, but for the cost of recycling a bottle, a little bit of sticky tape, some pine needles that you may have picked up on your dog walk, you've got something that looks really quite dramatic. And again, if my candle was taller, I'll fake it up and put my candle here. It's a little bit higher. I particularly like the rope coil that goes round it, because I think that's a lovely little detail. So it's decorative and functional at the same time. I quite like the little bit of berries, but I do find them quite stiff. And whereas you've got lots of movement with the pine needles, I just find that a slightly distracting element. And my favourite is with the berries that are pierced on the top. And it just gives that right amount of sort of polka dotness, if that's the word, across the top, which again makes it really eye-catching. You can see there as I'm just lifting up, there still is that little bit of natural movement, but they're not so heavy that they're going to collapse and spoil the display. If you are a really precise worker, this might cause you a little bit of grief, because the pine needles aren't straight. They've always got a curve on them. And unless you spend ages grading your pine cones, your pine needles, sorry, to get them all so they all go one way, I think you're going to have to accept that it's going to be a coverage, but they're not all upright. Some of them are going one way, some of them are going another. You can correct that as you go around with your second lot of pine needles and hopefully disguise the fact. I can see, for instance, I've got one sort of coming off that way, but I'm imagining it as a little sort of a crown, a little coronet kind of thing. Perhaps if you were going to a Christmas party or something like that, you could have your own little crown. So I hope that gives you enough of an idea of where this project is going. And the thing for today is, yes, it's a straightforward process, but it's time consuming. And the challenge for you today will be, how are you going to use this? Are you going to keep it simple and just imagine it's a cuff for your candle? Or are you going to get really creative and really imaginative and decide what you want to do? I quite like this side view with all the leftover little bits and pieces put in there. That could be a little bit of moss. And as you say, I've got a little bit of a garden gnome. Actually, I've got a garden gnome on a pick. I could perhaps do a photograph and put that in there as my fairy garden. And that could be a different way of displaying your arrangement. Something that's really eye-catching. Of course, if you're having it on the shelf would have to be quite deep, but you could certainly have it raised up as a centerpiece on your table as a really eye-catching little creative activity. So I'm probably going to close down the live video now, so we'll then move across to live Q&A. I can see I've got some questions. I think I might have missed them when I was working, so I can come back and answer those. I may well have answered some of them as I went along. So I shall say goodbye to those of you who are watching on record, and hopefully you'll enjoy these next few pictures of my finished arrangement. So I'll see you next week.